On the 15th of April 2004, America's market regulator moved against a company whose name had been pressed into British steel for 244 years. Its chief executive's assets were frozen. He was cast out of his own boardroom, and a court-appointed monitor was sent in to take control. Spear and Jackson, a name older than the United States itself, had been named in a fraud. Founded in Sheffield in 1760, it had outlived the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, and the slow death of British steel. Its saws and files were trusted in workshops the world over. Its name was a byword for craftsmanship. Yet by 2004, that name was being run not from a Sheffield forge, but from a boardroom in Florida. Its shares quietly funneled through shell companies in the Caribbean by the very man sworn to protect it. How does a 2.5-century-old institution end up captured by a stranger an ocean away? And why is almost every tool that bears its name today made nowhere near Sheffield? Sheffield, England, 1760 to the present day. This is the story of what happens when a craft becomes a commodity. In 1760, Sheffield was a town that ran on fire. Tucked into the valleys of South Yorkshire, where 5 rivers turned the wheels of countless grinding shops, it had spent centuries earning a reputation for cutlery and blades. But something had changed. 2 decades earlier, a quiet clockmaker named Benjamin Huntsman had perfected a way of melting steel in sealed clay crucibles, producing a metal harder, purer, and more uniform than anything Europe had seen. Crucible steel transformed Sheffield from a market town into the forge of a nation, and it drew ambitious men towards the heat. 2 of them were John Love, a draper by trade, and Alexander Spear, a merchant from nearby Wakefield. Cloth had given them a living, but a modest one. Steel, they reasoned, offered something better. In 1760, the pair turned their backs on the linen trade and went into business together, founding a small steel-making concern in Sheffield under the name Spear and Love. Their ambition was specific. They would make saws, tools that demanded the finest steel and the steadiest hands, in a city that could now supply both. It was a humble beginning. There were no roaring works yet, no acres of furnaces, just a partnership, a hearth, and the conviction that a well-made blade would always find a buyer. And in Georgian Britain, a country building ships, houses, furniture, and an empire. The demand for a saw that held its edge was very nearly endless. Businesses of that age, though, lived or died with the men who ran them, and the firm's future depended on who came next. By the early 19th century, the concern had passed to Alexander Spear's nephew, John. It was a critical moment. A name and a furnace could be inherited. Skill could not. And so, in 1814, John Spear did what generations of Sheffield masters had always done. He took on an apprentice. The young man's name was Sam Jackson. He was bound to his master to learn what the indentures of the time called the art, trade, or mystery of saw-making, a phrase that captured something true. Saw-making was not merely labor, it was a mystery in the old sense, a closely guarded body of knowledge handed from one pair of hands to the next that could not be written down or hurried. Tempering the steel, hammering it true, setting and sharpening each tooth. Every stage demanded judgment earned over years at the bench. Jackson learned it well. He proved gifted enough and trusted enough that he did not remain a journeyman for long. He rose through the workshop until, in 1830, he was made a full partner in the business he had entered as a boy. The firm took a new name to mark the moment, one that would outlast every man who first spoke it, and one that would still be stamped onto steel more than 2.5 centuries later. Spear and Jackson. For now, It was simply two surnames above a Sheffield workshop door. But the foundations had been laid. The finest steel in the world, a craft guarded like a secret, and a market that reached as far as British trade could carry it. The little saw-making partnership was about to become something far greater than its founders had ever dared imagine. By the middle of the 19th century, the small partnership had become a power. The workshop had grown into a sprawling industrial site, the Etna Works on Savile Street East, where the rhythms of the forge ran day and night. The name Spear and Jackson now sat among the great dynasties of Sheffield steel, and the men who carried it held a single, unshakable belief that nothing they sold should ever shame the mark stamped upon it. Saws remained the heart of the business. A Spear and Jackson handsaw was a tool a carpenter could stake his livelihood on. The blade tensioned and ground so that it ran straight and true, the teeth set to bite cleanly through oak or pine without binding. In the late 19th century, the firm adopted the elegant skewback saw. Its spine curved gently away from the cutting edge to shed weight without losing strength. It was the kind of refinement only generations at the bench could produce, a tool that felt in a craftsman's hand, almost alive. But Spear and Jackson was never a one-product house. From the Etna Works came files and rasps, edge tools and machine knives, agricultural implements, and an endless catalogue of hardware. The cutting instruments of an industrializing world, where there was timber to be shaped, metal to be dressed, or a harvest to be gathered, a Sheffield blade was likely doing the work. As early as 1872, the firm was patenting improvements to the very machinery that cut its files, proof that this was no museum of old habits, but a business determined to stay ahead of its trade. Behind every blade stood a small army of specialists. Forgers shaped the raw steel, hardeners heated and quenched it to the precise temper that gave a saw its spring. Grinders, hunched over spinning stones in clouds of dust, ground each blade to a mirror finish. A trade so dangerous it shortened lives. File cutters struck the rows of teeth into each file by hand, hammer and chisel rising and falling thousands of times a day. It was punishing, skilled, often hazardous work, and it was the true engine of the firm's reputation. The mark on the blade belonged to Spear and Jackson. The craft that earned it belonged to Sheffield. What bound it all together was a single word: Sheffield. By the Victorian age, the city's name had become a guarantee in itself, trusted in workshops from the dockyards of London to the benches of Bombay and Boston. British ships carried Sheffield steel to every corner of the empire and far beyond it. When an Englishman named Henry Diston left to build his own saw empire across the Atlantic, it was Sheffield's methods he carried in his hands. To stamp Spear and Jackson, Sheffield onto a blade, was to make a promise that the steel beneath would hold its edge anywhere on Earth. And for the better part of a century it did. Yet Spear and Jackson did not rise alone. It was one star in a remarkable constellation of Sheffield toolmakers, each pushing the others towards greater things. And across the same smoke-filled city, another firm was about to change the trade forever. Its founder was James Neal. In 1889, Neal patented something deceptively simple and quietly revolutionary: composite steel, a hard steel face fused to a softer, more flexible iron backing. A blade made this way could be both keen and forgiving, sharp where it mattered, and tough where it flexed. In 1909, Neal registered his composite steel products under a trademark that would become famous in its own right: Eclipse. And in 1911, the company used the method to perfect the composite steel hacksaw blade, a tool that would soon hang on the wall of nearly every engineering workshop in the country. For now, Neil and Spear and Jackson were rivals as much as neighbours, two proud Sheffield names, each guarding its own reputation. Neither could have guessed that one day they would become a single enterprise, their fates bound together by forces neither yet understood. But that was the future. At the turn of the 20th century, the picture was one of triumph. Sheffield was the cutlery and tool capital of the world, and Spear and Jackson stood near its summit. A firm that had survived for well over a century by refusing to compromise on the only thing that mattered, the quality of the steel. It seemed unassailable. The orders came in, the blades went out. The mark was trusted everywhere. No one walking the floor of the Etna Works at the dawn of the 20th century could have imagined that within a few generations, the saws would be made an ocean away. The company would change hands again and again, and that proud Sheffield name would one day be dragged into a courtroom for a crime committed in its own boardroom. The empire was built. Now came the long, slow business of losing it. The 20th century had begun in triumph. It would not end that way. One by one, the forces that had built Spear and Jackson began to slip away. 2 world wars drained Britain of men, money, and confidence. The empire that had carried Sheffield steel to every continent dissolved into independent nations, many of them now building factories of their own. And from the 1950s onward came a new and unforgiving rivalry. Tools made in Germany, in the United States, and increasingly across Asia, often produced in greater volume and sold at lower prices than a traditional Sheffield works could hope to match. For 2 centuries, Sheffield had been the undisputed capital of steel and edge tools. Now, slowly, the crown began to slip. The grinding shops that had once thundered along the city's rivers fell silent one by one. The great names that had filled the trade directories, saw makers, file cutters, cutlers whose families had worked metal for generations, began to vanish, absorbed, merged, or quietly shut. It was not a single dramatic collapse, but a long erosion, a tide going out over decades. The human cost was easy to overlook in the figures. Each closed workshop was a lifetime of knowledge with no one left to inherit it. The feel for when steel had reached the right temper, the practiced swing of a file cutter's hammer, skills that lived only in the hands that held them. A young man in Sheffield in 1900 could expect to spend his life in a trade as old as the city. His grandson, by the 1970s, could expect no such thing. The world that had made Spear and Jackson great was disappearing around it. Survival, it became clear, would mean scale. A small independent works could no longer buy raw materials cheaply enough, reach enough markets, or absorb a bad year. Across the trade, the proud old firms of Sheffield were ceasing to be independent businesses and becoming divisions of larger groups. Their names preserved as brands, their workshops folded into something bigger. The logic was hard to argue with. A larger company could weather storms that would sink a lone workshop. But a subtle change came with it. A firm that had once answered to one thing above all, the quality of its steel, was now learning to answer to another master entirely, the balance sheet. And then, in 1985, came the most telling moment of all. The proudest name in the city was about to be bought, not by a foreign giant, but by an old rival from just across the smoke. That rival was James Neil, the very firm that, a century earlier, had invented composite steel and built the Eclipse brand. Over the decades, Neil had grown from a single inventor's workshop into a Sheffield conglomerate, swallowing famous names along the way. The precision measurement maker Moore and Wright, the spanner and tool firm Britool, and others besides. In 1985, it added the greatest prize of all, The James Neal Group acquired Spear and Jackson, and a name that had stood independent for 225 years became a subsidiary of another. It was a sign of the times, and worse was to follow. In 1989, the year that should have marked Neal's own centenary, the family chose not to celebrate 100 years of independence, but to sell. The entire business passed to the private equity firm Apax Partners for £78 million. At a stroke, a sprawling group employing around 2,000 people, most of them still in Sheffield, ceased to be a family enterprise and became something altogether different, an investment. Apax made its intentions plain. It meant to expand the business and float it back onto the stock market within roughly 5 years. The company was no longer simply a maker of tools. It was a package to be improved, repriced, and resold. The timing could hardly have been worse. The recession of the early 1990s hammered demand for tools, and the group's fortune sagged. In 1992, a new chief executive was installed to halt the slide and rebuild the business for sale. Slowly, painfully, the figures were brought back into order. Then, in 1995, came an irony so complete it was almost poetic. The Neal Group looked across its collection of brands and chose to rename the entire company after the most valuable one it owned, James Neal, the firm that had bought Spear and Jackson. Now took the Spear and Jackson name for itself, becoming Spear and Jackson plc. The centuries-old name had won, in a sense. It had proved more precious than the company that purchased it, more trusted than any other label on the shelf. But it had won as a brand, not as a business. The craft, the independence, the family lineage that had begun in a Sheffield workshop in 1760. All of that had quietly ended. What remained was a name, valuable, portable, and for sale. And an asset that valuable, that portable, would not stay in Sheffield for long. The next buyer would not be a rival from across the city, nor even a firm from across the country. The next buyer would come from across the Atlantic. And under its ownership, Spear and Jackson would stop being a factory at all. The buyer came from America. By the late 1990s, the Spear and Jackson name had passed into the hands of U.S. Industries, a vast American conglomerate whose sprawling interests ranged from bathroom fittings to industrial products, and whose connection to Sheffield, to saws, or to 2.5 centuries of craft was precisely nil. To a company of that size, Spear and Jackson was not a heritage. It was a line item, one modestly profitable tool division among dozens of holdings, valued not for what it made, but for what it might be worth. On the ground in Sheffield, at first, little seemed to change. The work still ran, the men still clocked in, the saws and files still rolled off the line, stamped as ever with the city's name. The British operation even moved into a new, modern facility, proof on paper of investment and confidence. To a worker on the factory floor, the firm looked much as it always had. But the decisions that governed its future were no longer made in South Yorkshire. They were made across an ocean by people who had never seen the forge and who thought of the company not as a craft to be protected, but as an asset to be managed. For the people who actually made the tools, this was the strangest part. A man grinding a blade in Sheffield was, in a sense, working for shareholders he would never meet, in a country he might never visit, to satisfy expectations measured not in saws sold, but in share price. The quality of his work still mattered. A bad blade still came back as a complaint. But it was no longer the point of the enterprise. The point, increasingly, was the value of the company itself, a number that could be raised or lowered, bought or sold, far from any forge. And an asset, eventually, is sold. Around the turn of the millennium, US Industries decided it no longer wished to own a British toolmaker and looked for a way out. The exit it found would change everything. Through a merger with a small, little-known American outfit called Megapro Tools, the public company carrying the Spear and Jackson name re-emerged in an unfamiliar place. It was no longer listed in London, among the blue-chip names of British industry. It now traded in the United States on the over-the-counter market, the loosely regulated fringe of the stock world where small and speculative companies are bought and sold. Its shares changed hands under a four-letter ticker, SJCK. Its headquarters were not in Sheffield, nor anywhere in Britain, but in an office in Boca Raton, Florida, a sun-bleached town of golf courses and gated communities some 4,000 miles from the rivers that had once powered its furnaces. It is difficult to imagine two worlds further apart. In Sheffield, men in steel-capped boots still tempered blades in a working forge. In Florida, the same company existed as a line on a trading screen. A penny stock, watched by speculators who would never hold one of its tools. Traded for cents on the promise of what it might one day become. The name that had meant unbending quality for 240 years had been reduced to a ticker symbol. The craft of Sheffield had become a bet on a market most of its workers did not even know existed. How a company older than the United States ended up as an American penny stock is, in part, simply the story of late 20th century capitalism. Businesses bought, broken up, repackaged, and relisted by owners chasing returns rather than building things. But it also left the firm dangerously exposed, stripped of the protections of a major exchange and the scrutiny that comes with size. The Spear and Jackson name was now afloat in the murkiest waters of the financial world. And a famous name in murky waters attracts a certain kind of fish. For in such markets, a familiar swindle had a name: the pump and dump. The idea was old and brutally simple. First, the price was pumped, talked up through glowing reports and tips whispered to brokers and investors, stirring a frenzy of buying that drove the shares higher. Then, at the peak, the insiders who had quietly hoarded cheap stock dumped it onto the eager crowd, selling out for a fortune before the inflated price inevitably collapsed, and leaving ordinary investors holding shares worth a fraction of what they had paid. It was a confidence trick dressed in the language of the markets, and it thrived precisely where Spear and Jackson now found itself, among small, obscure stocks where a good story could move a price, and where few were watching closely enough to ask whether the story was true. And into this world, into the chairman's chair of one of the oldest names in British industry, a new man now stepped. He held a controlling stake in the company's stock and ran it from Florida, far from the eyes of its British workforce. He spoke the language of growth and shareholder value, and he carried with him a history that the company's investors knew nothing about. A history that, had they known it, might have made them think twice before trusting him with a single penny. His name was Dennis Crowley. To understand what Dennis Crowley did to Spear and Jackson, it helps to understand what Dennis Crowley was not. He was not a toolmaker. He was not an engineer, nor a steelman, nor anything that Sheffield would have recognized. He was a financier, and not one in good standing. In 1991, more than a decade before he took control of the company, Crowley had been a registered representative, a licensed stockbroker, authorized to buy and sell securities for the public. That authority did not last. In that year, he was permanently barred from association with any member of the National Association of Securities Dealers, the body that licensed and policed America's brokers. To be barred by the NASD was no minor reprimand. It was expulsion. It meant the industry had judged him unfit to handle other people's money and had closed the door on him for good. And yet, by the early 2000s, this same barred broker sat at the very top of a publicly traded company, not as some junior employee, but as its chief executive and the chairman of its board. The company was Spear and Jackson. The man the securities industry had thrown out was now in command of one of the oldest names in British manufacturing, with the power to speak for it, sign for it, and trade in its shares. How a man barred from the brokerage business came to control a listed company at all was itself a product of the murky world Spear and Jackson had drifted into. On the lightly policed over-the-counter market, ownership could be assembled quietly through mergers and share issues that drew little attention. A great name, a small float, and an absence of scrutiny. It was an environment almost designed for someone like Crowley to slip through. The protections a major exchange or a watchful regulator might have offered simply were not there. His grip was total. Crowley owned more than half of all the company's stock, a controlling stake that, in theory, should have given ordinary shareholders an owner with every reason to make the business thrive. But the ownership was not what it seemed. Crowley did not hold those shares openly in his own name, where investors and regulators could see them. He held them in secret. The mechanism was a classic of financial concealment. Crowley had quietly amassed hundreds of thousands of shares of Spear and Jackson and of the predecessor company before it, through 3 nominee companies registered in the British Virgin Islands. A nominee company is, in essence, a corporate mask, a business that exists on paper to hold assets on behalf of someone who would rather not be named. The British Virgin Islands, a cluster of Caribbean territories with strict secrecy and few questions asked, were the perfect place to register them. On the public record, the shares belonged to 3 obscure offshore firms. In reality, every one of them answered to a single man in Florida. He even reached for shares he was expressly forbidden to touch. Some of the stock he funneled to himself had been issued under a special registration meant for a company's own employees and consultants. Precisely the kind of securities a man in his position was barred from receiving. The rules existed to stop people like him. He went around them. The deception was compounded by the company itself, which failed to disclose to the public the full extent of Crowley's ownership. So the picture presented to the outside world was a comfortable fiction. Investors looking at Spear and Jackson saw a venerable British brand newly listed with shares available to buy. What they could not see was that the man running it secretly controlled a vast block of those shares through anonymous shells in the Caribbean, and that he had a powerful, hidden reason to want the price to rise. Because secret shares are only worth something if you can sell them. And to sell them at a profit, Crowley needed a crowd of eager buyers. He needed the price to climb. He needed, in short, a machine for manufacturing excitement. In early 2002, he hired one. The machine was called International Media Solutions. Based in Florida, IMS presented itself to the world as an investor relations firm, the sort of business a company might legitimately hire to spread word of its prospects. It was nothing of the kind. IMS was a stock promotion operation run by 2 principals named Yolanda Velasquez and Kermit Silver, and it was never registered with the regulators at all. Its purpose here was singular: to talk up the price of Spear and Jackson shares until the buyers came running. Beginning in early 2002, IMS went to work on the brokerage community, telephoning and feeding information to registered representatives across the country, the very brokers whose recommendations ordinary investors trusted. The information was false and misleading. The story it told was seductive. Here was Spear and Jackson, a storied British toolmaker with 2.5 centuries of history, an undiscovered gem trading for pennies and poised to climb. The age of the name was not incidental to the con. It was the con's greatest asset. Who would suspect a fraud wearing the clothes of a 240-year-old institution? Crowley played his own part from the top, issuing false statements about the company's financial progress, painting the picture of a business surging ahead, precisely the kind of news that sends a small stock soaring. And the men selling the story to the public were not the impartial advisors they pretended to be. The sales agents pushing Spear and Jackson shares were quietly pocketing commissions of up to 10% on every sale, paid in effect to recommend the stock while assuring their clients the recommendation was disinterested. It worked. The buying began, and as it did, the price rose. Each new investor lured in by the promotion drove the shares a little higher, which made the story look a little truer, which drew in the next investor. A rising price is its own advertisement. The frenzy fed itself, and while the crowd rushed in, Crowley quietly slipped out. This was the dump. As the price climbed on the strength of the lies, Crowley sold, not openly, as a chairman selling his own stock would be obliged to, but secretly, through the anonymous British Virgin Islands accounts that hid his hand. Share by share, through the offshore shells, he turned his concealed holdings into cash. By the time he was finished, his illegal sales of Spear and Jackson stock totaled more than $3 million. The broker that handled those trades had every reason to be suspicious and chose not to be. Hundreds of thousands of shares in a small company sold steadily through offshore accounts controlled from behind a corporate veil. It was the textbook signature of something wrong. By law, a broker faced with such warning signs is required to file a report flagging the suspicious activity to the authorities. None was filed. The trades simply went through again and again, a failure so stark that the regulators would later single it out as a case in its own right, one of the first times a broker was charged purely for turning a blind eye. The cruelty of the design lay in who stood on the other side of every trade. For Crowley to sell, someone had to buy, and the buyers were ordinary investors trusting two things at once: a famous British name that had stood for honesty for 240 years, and brokers who swore they were giving impartial advice. They were buying, at inflated prices, the very shares the chairman was secretly dumping on them. Every ounce of trust that generations of Sheffield craftsmen had forged into that name was now being spent, not to make tools, but to bait a trap. For a time, it all held together. The money flowed out through the Caribbean. The shares changed hands. The story held, and nobody with the power to stop it seemed to be looking too closely. But pump and dump schemes leave a wake. Offshore accounts, suspicious trading patterns, a barred broker secretly selling millions in stock. These are not things that stay buried forever. Some 4,000 miles from Sheffield, in the offices of America's securities regulator, questions were beginning to form, and on a spring morning in 2004, the answers would arrive all at once. The reckoning was coming to Boca Raton. The 15th of April 2004 began like any other day. In Boca Raton, the Florida sun rose over the office from which a barred broker had spent 2 years quietly selling off one of Britain's oldest names. In Sheffield, 4,000 miles and 5 time zones away, the works were already running. The morning shift at the bench, the saws and files moving down the line as they had for the better part of 3 centuries. Neither place knew that this was the day everything would change. The change did not come with sirens or handcuffs. It came, as these things do in the financial world, on paper. But paper with the force of the United States government behind it. That morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission walked into the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida and filed a complaint. The defendants were Dennis Crowley, the stock promoters who had served him, and the company itself, Spear and Jackson Inc. For 244 years, the name had been stamped on steel that craftsmen staked their reputations on. Now, for the first time, it appeared at the head of a federal fraud complaint. What happened next happened fast, far faster than the slow machinery of justice usually allows. At the Commission's request, Judge Donald P. Middlebrooks granted emergency relief, a temporary restraining order, and a battery of measures designed to stop the bleeding before another dollar could vanish. The assets of Dennis Crowley were frozen. So were those of the promoters. The trail of money that had run out through the Caribbean was, within hours, seized and sealed. To grasp how extraordinary that was, consider what a frozen asset means. In an ordinary dispute, money can be argued over for years. Here, on a single morning, a federal judge reached across the financial system and locked every account within reach, not as a punishment after a trial, but as an emergency measure to stop a suspected fraud from spiriting away its proceeds before the case could even be heard. The law had decided it could not afford to wait. Then came the blow no shareholder could have imagined. By order of the court, the man who owned more than half of Spear and Jackson, its chairman, its chief executive, the single most powerful figure in the company, was stripped of his offices and temporarily barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company at all. Overnight, the owner was locked out of his own boardroom. And into the vacuum, the court placed a stranger, a corporate monitor, an independent overseer answerable not to Crowley but to the judge, was appointed to take control of the company's operations and protect it from the very man who had been running it. The monitor's task was unusual and revealing, not to wind the company down, but to keep it alive, to steady the ship and shield the real productive business from the wreckage its own chairman had made of its name. A British institution that had stood independent since the Georgian age was now, in effect, a ward of an American federal court. It would have been easy, reading the headlines, to assume there was nothing real left to protect. That Spear and Jackson was by now just a hollow ticker symbol, a fraud with no substance behind it. The truth was the opposite, and it was the cruelest part of the whole affair. Behind the Florida listing stood a genuine working business. The company employed more than 750 people. In the financial year that had ended the previous September, it had turned over more than $90 million, and the majority of that money had been earned not in America, but in Britain and across Europe. Real factories, real workers, real tools still leaving the line. This was the bitter irony at the heart of it. The very numbers that made Spear and Jackson worth defrauding, the orders, the revenue, the global reach, were earned by the labour of people in South Yorkshire who had never heard of the British Virgin Islands and never would. They had built something solid. A man on another continent had used it as a stage prop in a swindle. For as the court orders were being signed in Florida, it was still, in Sheffield, simply another working day. The news reached Sheffield the next day. By the 16th of April, the story was public on both sides of the Atlantic. Spear and Jackson, the name on the saws, the files, the garden tools, the name that had meant Sheffield for the better part of 3 centuries, was at the center of a securities fraud case in a Florida courtroom, its chairman frozen out, its affairs handed to a court-appointed monitor. For the men and women at the Sheffield works, it must have been a bewildering thing to absorb. Their craft had never been in question. They had forged good steel and made honest tools, exactly as their predecessors had. The betrayal had happened somewhere else entirely. in a boardroom an ocean away, in a world of share prices, offshore accounts, and stock promoters that had nothing to do with the forge and everything to do with the name above its door. And yet, it was their company in the headlines, their livelihoods suddenly tangled in a scandal they had played no part in creating. It is one of the recurring tragedies of modern industry, that the people who make the things a company sells are so often the last to be consulted and the first to be exposed when those above them fail. The grinders, the hardeners, the office staff, and the salespeople of Spear and Jackson had spent their careers honoring a promise generations old. None of them had sold a share through a Caribbean shell. None had touted a stock to a single broker. Yet it was their security, their pensions and their futures that now hung on the judgment of a court they would never see. The financial damage, meanwhile, unfolded exactly as the architecture of the scheme had guaranteed. A pump and dump has only one ending, and the exposure of the fraud triggered it. The share price that had been so carefully inflated went into freefall. By the end of the year, it had collapsed to less than a quarter of the peak it reached at the height of the promotion. The value the promoters had conjured had never truly existed. Now it simply evaporated, and the ordinary investors lured in at the top were left holding shares worth a fraction of what they had paid. Many were not seasoned speculators who understood the risks. They were ordinary people who had trusted a respectable-sounding name and a confident-sounding broker. Ruined and angry, a wave of them turned to the courts, and shareholder lawsuits broke over the company. Step back, and the scale of what had happened comes into focus. Spear and Jackson had survived the Industrial Revolution. It had survived the rise and fall of the empire that once carried its steel to the world. It had survived 2 world wars and the long, grinding decline of British heavy industry. Foreign competition had not killed it. Recession had not killed it. Even the loss of its independence had not killed it. What finally brought the company to its knees was none of these things. It was a single man who had looked at 244 years of accumulated trust and seen only an asset to be liquidated. That was the dark genius of it, the very thing that made Spear and Jackson valuable. Its name, its reputation, the quiet confidence that the word Sheffield on a blade meant something, was the thing Crowley weaponized. He did not steal the company's machines or its steel. He stole its good name and spent it. The collapse that Sheffield's workers had always feared would come from cheap imports or empty order books arrived instead from the one direction no one had been watching: the boardroom. And yet, and this is the strange defining truth of the whole story, the factory did not close. There was no final shift. No last blade came off the line to the sound of a falling silence. The furnaces did not go cold. For all the wreckage at the top, the working business at the bottom was still sound, still making tools, still earning its keep. That, in the end, was the whole purpose of the monitor the court had installed, to keep this 244-year-old institution breathing, while the men who had nearly killed it were dealt with. Spear and Jackson would survive its own betrayal, but it would never again be the proud, independent house of steel that Sam Jackson had joined as a boy. The immediate crisis had been contained, but the reckoning had only just begun. There were debts to be paid, for the investors who had been robbed, for the law that had been broken, and for the man who had broken it. The question now was who would answer for it, and how. That accounting would come the following year. Justice, when it came slowly, and in money. In February 2005, almost a year after the court orders fell, Dennis Crowley settled with the Securities and Exchange Commission. He admitted no guilt. Settlements of this kind rarely require it, but the terms spoke plainly enough. He agreed to hand back what he had taken, and a penalty on top. In total, more than $6 million. Of that, over $4 million was disgorgement and interest, the return of his ill-gotten gains, and $2 million was a civil penalty, a fine for the harm he had done. The temporary bar of the previous spring was made permanent. Crowley was shut out for good from serving as an officer or director of any public company, barred from the penny stock offerings he had exploited, barred from the kind of securities he had funneled to himself. The man who had been expelled from the brokerage industry back in 1991 and who had simply walked around that judgment to seize a public company anyway, was now locked out far more comprehensively. The promoters who had helped him did not escape either. They too were ordered to surrender their profits and pay penalties of their own. But the most remarkable chapter of the aftermath was still to come, and it belonged not to the swindler, but to his victim. The commission did not simply collect the penalties and file them away. It set about returning the money to the people who had lost it. A distribution agent was appointed, claims were gathered, sums were calculated, and in June 2008, more than 4 years after the fraud was exposed, the SEC distributed over $5.5 million to 534 defrauded investors. The figure that mattered most was the percentage. It represented a full 100% return of their losses. Every ordinary investor who had been lured into buying the stock at its inflated, lie-driven peak got back, in the end, exactly what they had put in. This was no small thing. In most frauds of this kind, the money is long gone by the time the authorities arrive. Siphoned offshore, spent, or simply untraceable. Victims of pump and dump schemes typically recover pennies on the pound, if anything at all. That these particular investors were made whole was a measure both of how quickly the regulators had moved and of how much they had managed to freeze on that April morning in 2004. And yet, a check can only repair what a check can measure. The investors recovered their dollars, but there were things no settlement could give back. For more than 2 centuries, the words Spear and Jackson, Sheffield, had been a kind of promise that the steel beneath would not let you down, that the name could be trusted. Dennis Crowley had taken that promise 2.5 centuries in the making and spent it on a confidence trick. No court could unspend it. Customers who had once reached for a Spear and Jackson tool without a second thought now had reason to wonder what the name behind it had become. The dollars came back, the dignity did not. And there was a deeper loss still, one that had nothing to do with Crowley at all, and that no regulator was ever going to put right. While the courts in Florida tallied up disgorgements and penalties, the quieter, longer story of Spear and Jackson was still unfolding 4,000 miles away. For the true fate of this company was not decided in a courtroom. It was being decided slowly and without headlines on the factory floor in Sheffield, and in the rising hum of new factories on the other side of the world. The loss that mattered most was the one that made no headlines. There was no court case for it, no monitor, no settlement. It happened the way most things of this kind happen in modern industry, gradually, quietly, and for reasons that were perfectly understandable. To survive in a world of cheap, high-volume competition, Spear and Jackson did what almost the whole of British manufacturing did in the closing decades of the 20th century and the opening of the 21st. By the company's own account, it reduced its costs by relocating selected manufacturing to Asia. Much of the making moved east, to factories, including the group's own operation in China, that could turn out tools in greater volume and at lower cost than any Sheffield works ever could. Consider what that meant for the 4 words that had once been a promise to the world: Spear and Jackson, Sheffield. For 2.5 centuries, that mark had told the buyer where the steel was born. In a city on 5 rivers, shaped by hands that had inherited the craft. Now, for a great many of the tools that carry the name, the steel is born elsewhere. The brand still proudly bears the date of its founding, but the place behind the promise had, for much of the range, quietly changed. And with the making went something less tangible. The mystery of the trade, the feel for the right temper, the practiced judgment of the sawsmith and the file cutter, had never been written in any manual. It lived in the hands that did the work, and it was handed from one generation of Sheffield workers to the next. Move the work abroad, and in time, the craft moves with it. A name can be exported in an afternoon. The knowledge that earned the name takes centuries to build and can be lost in a single generation. It would be easy to cast this as another betrayal, but that would be unfair. This was not Crowley's swindle. No one was deceived, no one was robbed. It was survival. The same hard arithmetic that had already closed 1,000 workshops across Sheffield. The firms that refused to adapt mostly vanished altogether. Offshoring, in the cold logic of the balance sheet, is a large part of why the name still survives at all. The body lived. But to keep it alive, much of its soul had been sent 4,000 miles away. Not all of it, though. The headquarters stayed in Sheffield, on the same South Yorkshire ground where it all began. And in one quiet corner of the modern group, the old craft refused to die. Robert Sorby, a fellow Sheffield toolmaker, founded in 1828 and now part of the same family of brands, still makes its specialist woodworking tools in the city, designed and forged there as they have been for nearly 200 years. It is a small thing set against the scale of what moved east. But it is a living ember of what the whole company once was. Proof that, somewhere in Sheffield, hands still shape steel the way they always did. So the question that opened this story finally has its answer. Why is almost every tool that bears the name made nowhere near Sheffield? Because survival demanded it. The harder question is the one that remains. Can a name outlive the craft that created it? And what, in the end, is such a name still worth? Spear and Jackson had survived its betrayal and exported its soul. There was one chapter left to write, and in 2014, the old name would change hands one final time. In 2014, the journey reached its present destination. The Spear and Jackson name, bought and sold so many times across its long life, changed hands one final time. Having already drifted into Hong Kong ownership, the brand was acquired by SNH Global, a diversified holding company headquartered there. The firm that a draper and a Wakefield merchant had founded on the rivers of South Yorkshire in 1760 was now, ultimately, owned from the far side of the world. And yet, owned. Not closed, not erased, not consigned to a museum like so many of his Sheffield neighbours. Spear and Jackson is still very much alive. Its tools are sold in more than 100 countries. Its headquarters remain, even now in Sheffield, on the same South Yorkshire ground where it all began. After more than 260 years, through revolution, war, fraud, and the great unmaking of British industry, the name endures, outliving very nearly every company that was its contemporary, and most that came after. What then is the lesson of Spear and Jackson? Perhaps it is this, that a name can prove more durable than the thing that made it. The craft that built the reputation has largely gone abroad. The family that gave it its name is long departed. The independence ended decades ago, and still the name lives, because a name, once it earns the world's trust, becomes an asset in its own right, valuable, portable, and very hard to kill. But that durability is a double-edged blade. The very quality that let Spear and Jackson survive its worth as a brand, detached from any one factory or owner, was exactly what made it vulnerable. When a company becomes an abstraction, a thing to be traded rather than a thing that is made, it can be carried far from the people who built it into the hands of those who care nothing for what it once meant. The Crowley affair was the extreme symptom of that drift, the moment a 244-year-old promise became raw material for a swindle. The slow export of its making was the quieter version of the same story. In that sense, Spear and Jackson is the history of British manufacturing written small. A nation that once made things for the world gradually became a nation that owned the names, licensed the brands, and watched the making move elsewhere. Something was gained in that bargain: survival, reach, lower prices. And something was lost that no balance sheet records: the knowledge in the hands, the dignity of the work, the bond between a name and a place. And so the next time a Spear and Jackson saw is lifted from a shelf, its handle familiar, its blade keen, its name as old as nations, it is worth remembering everything folded into those two words. A draper's gamble in 1760, the roar of the Etna works, a craft guarded like a secret, a betrayal hatched an ocean away, and a stubborn refusal against every odd simply to disappear. The empire of the blade outlived its own fall. Whether it can outlive the loss of its craft is a question the next century will have to answer. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to look at the tools in your own shed or workshop and at the names stamped upon them. Behind each one is a history like this, waiting to be told. Subscribe and hit like to follow more of these stories. And tell us in the comments which forgotten empire we should bring back to life next.